Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Now, well, welcome everybody to our very calmly titled event today, RIP SDGs. We did just put a note in. If you are not going to be speaking today, it would be wonderful if you could turn off your video to try and reduce the carbon emissions of what we're doing today. But please, obviously, speakers, keep your videos on. Right. We're here today, and just as a background, I think, to Scientists Warning Europe, why we're running this event and that sort of thing first. Then we'll move in to introduce the speakers and get them to do their introductions to us before we start the debate. So Scientists Warning Europe is representing the tens of thousands of scientists who've signed the 4 Great Warnings to Humanity. So in 1992, 2017, 2019, and in 2021. The film that you saw was connected to the 2021 warning, which came out at COP27, and that's the Scientists' Warnings into Action paper. And I'm pleased to say that we have Phoebe Barnard, the lead author from that, on our call today. Now, Scientists' Warnings, the second and third Scientists' Warnings are probably the most endorsed scientific papers ever. And in all of the last 3 warnings, they concentrate on 6 different areas. So that's food, nature, population, pollutants, energy, and economy. And the last paper that came out at COP26 also brought in leadership. And you could see that that was actually being mentioned in the film, particularly about political leadership, but also focusing on business and financial leadership and community leadership. So leadership at all levels, because there's only so much the scientists can do telling us all the time about what's going wrong and how to put it right if we don't do it ourselves. So the point of Scientists Warning Europe, the point of these meetings, and the point of the papers is getting it out there and encouraging everybody to take leadership and start moving everything forward. Now, we clearly have a momentous day today, in a sense, a birthday, but also could be seen as a very worrying development, and that's that the 8 billionth person on the planet was born today. Now, just to put that in context, I don't know how old you think I am, but roughly speaking, when I was born, there were about 4 billion people on the planet. So just in my lifetime, we put another 4 billion people on the planet. Now, in terms of the SDGs, we're going to be talking about them today, and hopefully we've got a range of views amongst the people on the panel, so that we can then get you both introduced to the SDGs and also give you an opportunity to hear different views on how they're working and how wonderful they are or not, depending on your point of view. Now, for those who don't, I mean, my very brief introduction to the SDGs, and I am absolutely not an expert in SDGs. So the experts are the people we're going to be hearing from in a minute. But the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the UN in 2015 as a call to action for people to address 5 critical areas of importance by 2030. So they were aimed at action by 2030. And that's people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Now, what I'm going to do now, I will just go through and I will introduce all 4 of our speakers. And then we will come to the speakers to introduce themselves. And initially, they will just be talking about their own experience, particularly with SDGs, but other relevant experience for a short time. And then we will come and start talking about the SDGs themselves in a second round from the speakers. So with us today, we have Naomi Sheehan, so Sustainable Development Consultant and Scientist and Climate Advisor, Climate Emergency Advisor, and LinkedIn's top green voice for thought leadership. I'm sure Naomi will explain that when she comes to her time. Carter Dillard, Fair Start Movement Policy Advisor, Senior Research Fellow of the University of Denver. Carter at one point had written a letter asking the UN to recommend smaller families, and that's as recommended in the 3rd Scientists' Warning, which is the Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency in 2019. Victoria Harvey, a PhD researcher on climate change at the University of East Anglia, exploring the connection between climate change and organizational transition to net zero. Also, Victoria is the co-founder of Climber, advising the media industry in the UK on net zero. And then last but not least is Steve Pipe, author, accountant, former UK Entrepreneur of the Year. At the moment, working on a unique giving back program, which helps everybody, including particularly accountants, to make a positive contribution towards the 17 Global Sustainable Development Goals making the world a better, fairer, kinder, and more sustainable place. So we've got a wide variety of experience here, and we're hoping that they're going to give us their best thoughts on the SDGs, and then we'll get a lively debate on it afterwards. We're going to start by coming to Steve Pipe. And Steve, within your, first introduction then, please, just introducing yourselves, just a bit more than I've said, so that everybody gets a feeling of it. Starting with Steve Pipe, please.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening. I feel a bit of an imposter here. I'm really not an expert in very much at all, other than perhaps one tiny, very simple idea, which I think nevertheless could be a powerful one. I'm certainly not as clever as everyone else here, and I'm not a scientist, and I absolutely categorically don't have all the answers. Neither am I actually an activist. I am an actionist, though. For me, it's about taking action, and the actions that I choose to focus on are those that are shaped by my career as an accountant, as an economist formerly, and as an entrepreneur. And most crucially, 3 weeks ago, I became a grandparent for the first time. And so the urgency, the importance, the significance of the stuff we're talking about, creating and leaving a better legacy, are in even sharper focus now for me and my family than they were before. Specifically, I have set a goal of I retired at 55 deliberately early, way before my pension kicked in, so that I could dedicate the rest of my life to my goal. My goal is to help unlock 100 million days of help, to help small and medium-sized businesses across the world unlock 100 million days of help focused on the SDGs. I'm not an expert in the SDGs either, but so far we're at 37 million days of help. So stuff is happening, and it's very exciting and very humbling, and it's a great honor to be here with you this evening.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Naomi, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. My name's Naomi. I am also a bit of an outlier in this space. 5 years ago, I was a global business executive of one of the biggest multinational companies in the world. So I have a very different perspective in terms of the SDGs. I know what it's like to be approaching this from within a business and how hard it can be to transform. And really, what made me transfer into climate and into sustainable development was the concern around how quickly the pace and the momentum of climate change was happening. So I changed career. I completely left my corporate career for climate emergency policy and sustainable development science. I've been a humanitarian all of my life, but I was getting very concerned in terms of the extinction pathways that we were on. And equally, I've been a climate consultant since then, trying to help both companies and government and institutions to transform. So I've worked both on the policy making side with governments and also the business process side with businesses.
Wonderful. Thank you, Naomi. Victoria, would you like to go next, please?
Hi, yes. I am predominantly a PhD researcher at the University of East Anglia, and my work there is social science research. It focuses on values and behaviours in and around climate actions. And then how do we take these values and behaviours into the workplace? So really, it's an interesting way to look at the climate science and the climate movement, in that if we really discern and find out what we value, and we take that into the workplace and we push that in a commercial way, then it creates better outcomes for businesses and citizens. Also, on the other side of things, I work as a sustainability consultant and mainly focused on the advertising, broadcast and media sectors with my business partner. And we work with media companies to shift them towards net zero by 2030, and the true meaning of net zero by 2030. So really, it's an interesting mix. Both sides of this approach work together, and that we're looking at the behavioural aspects of what we value in the climate change, but also the real practical kind of operational side, the challenges that lie there, looking at the value chain, scope analysis of 1, 2 and 3, and how difficult it is for businesses and the challenges they face in making that transition, but also understanding what does real leadership take, what does it look like, and how is that driven? And so they work quite well together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Victoria. And last but not least, Carter.
Thanks very much, Ed. Carter Diller, and I'm with the University of Denver as a senior research fellow. I published a book entitled Justice as a Fair Start in Life recently that I did the research with the Uhura Center at the University of Oxford. And the thesis is very simple. I'm a lawyer by training. And in looking back at the development of UN policy, the SDGs, there was a glaring mistake. It was either a mistake or it was an intentional it was an intentional attack on human rights. And that was treating the act of family planning as something that's personal to the parents instead of interpersonal to the children, and something that should be geared around ensuring that children are born in conditions consistent with the Children's Rights Convention. If children have rights to certain conditions of development, then we should be aiming to create children in those conditions and giving them what they want. The reality is, over the past 50 years, the United Nations and states never did that. They, in fact, used the arc of growth to create wealth. They used the growth to ensure growth in economies rather than ensuring what children need. Had we done that, had we ensured that children were born in conditions consistent with the Children's Convention, we never would have had the climate crisis. But by exploiting growth, we created this result. And so my work now is to try to reverse it, essentially by taking that wealth, the wealth that was made by violating human rights, and using it in the form of incentives and entitlements to change the way we plan families, to bring children geographically, temporally, and in other ways into conditions consistent with the convention, and to try to minimize the harm. I think that's the most effective thing we can do to get to the SDGs.
Great, thank you, Carter. And I suppose I should have introduced myself at the beginning, but I'm Ed Gemmell, the Managing Director of Scientists Warning Europe. And I'll be comparing today. Now we're going to move on and ask each of our speakers to come up with a few minutes, literally about the SDGs, their view on it, and everything else. And we thought we'd come to Steve first, and maybe ask Steve if you could indulge us with even a minute or two of describing the SDGs in their most sort of basic form. Let us know what they're there and what the aim is, and then maybe come into the way that you're working with them and your opinion of them.
Well, yeah, thrilled to do that. Again, I am no expert. I'm an ordinary human being, but who cares passionately about what the SDGs stand for. My understanding is this, that back in 2015, every single civilized country in the world got together to agree, codify a set of goals specifically designed to identify and give us a framework for understanding and starting to tackle all the key problems facing mankind, the planet, and our future. And so those are the 17 SDGs, often referred to as the UN Global Goals. They are so important to me that I have them up on my wall here. I regularly wear a badge, and so that I can actually say myself, looking over my shoulder, have them printed out in front of me at all times. And they provide, as it were, a really useful framework for thinking about what needs to be done and where to focus our efforts. And because they're so visual as well, they provide this instant talking point in my experience. But they are this codification of the key problems that we face. And they are what's at the heart of the one little narrow piece of expertise that I have, which is trying to do something about those in the simplest way. Now, we are well behind. Globally, we are well behind pretty much every one of those goals. If we're going to achieve them by 2030, we absolutely have to accelerate and ramp up the action that we all take. And it's patently obvious to me that we can't expect governments to do that alone. So my chosen pathway is to help galvanize the small and medium-sized business community, which historically has played almost no part in doing something positive about that. Big businesses have their own agenda around it. It's not the audience that I can speak to or connect with or influence, but small, medium-sized businesses is the area where I've focused. I've recently written a book called Our Time to Rise, which, by the way, I don't sell, I give away. And it's not in paper form, it's in digital form, so we can get it into as many hands as possible. It's just setting out a simple process for how small and medium-sized businesses can do something. Are the SDGs perfect? Absolutely not. Of course, they're not. Nothing is, but they guide me, they inspire me every single day. As I say, I have them on my wall. I decided to retire early and dedicate my life to trying to take measurable action on them every single day. I believe that we can live we can be what I call live a life for good, and in our business context, we can run businesses for good, or we can work in businesses for good. And I'll happily explain what I mean by those and how that can contribute later if that's of interest. But to my mind, it's much better on, I'm sure there's lots of perspectives here, and those perspectives will be born from, much deeper research and much greater analysis and insight and academic rigor than mine. But to my mind, it's better to focus our energies on the framework that we have and to drive more awareness, because it is staggering how few people have been made aware even of their existence, let alone acting around them. And I personally choose to focus my energies on raising awareness and then driving action around those SDGs, because I think the risk is that if we take the RIP SDG approach, the risk is that we expend a lot of our energy looking for the next bright shiny object, something else that will be better, instead of working with what we have when now is the time for action, not constantly striving for maybe a different framework which will crack it for us. I think ultimately it's human nature that needs to change, not the framework, and we need to build better behaviors into our habits, and we need to live our values, not just list them. In the business world, so many people are great at listing their values. They have these things listed up corporately, but those don't show up in their behaviors. And it's crucial, I think, that we need to start getting our values showing up in our behaviors. And in my experience, the SDGs provide a great starting point for helping us do that.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for the intro part of that as well. Victoria, maybe you could pick up on that, talk about your own views on it, but maybe if you had as well some other descriptive introductory thoughts on SDGs to get started with, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Steve said there. I mean, I think it's really interesting that the SDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, of which there were only 8, and so there is this kind of expanded focus on what's needed going forward. But yes, I mean, have all of them been met? 15 out of 17, perhaps not in the last few years. I think one of the things for myself, it's really difficult to comment on all of them because there are so many different aspects and nuances to all the goals. So I really wanted to focus on goal number 8. That's because, like Naomi, I've worked for a lot of time in businesses as a business director, and I understand the challenges working in the consultancy that businesses are facing, trying to transition towards some kind of sustainable growth. So goal number 8 talks about decent work and economic growth. So the first one we're not going to argue with. Decent work is fine. Everybody understands that. But this general statement of economic growth, and then further down the line, sustainable economic growth, definitely needs a bit more examination. In the notes of that goal in 8.1, it talks about GDP in developing countries increasing per capita by 7%. That's absolutely fine. We understand that developing countries need to grow their economy to meet basic human needs. And it's not something that I want to talk about here. But what about the rest of the world? And certainly what about the global north? So further points in that goal talk about economic growth being decoupled from environmental degradation, being decoupled from increasing emissions, and come with global resource sufficiency. So straight away, we can see that clearly this has not been happening. This is not happening now, and it actually shows no sign of happening in the future. We are growing our economies at around about 2%, depending on where you are. Emissions are continuing to rise, parts per million are going up, resource depletion is accelerating, and we're destroying the natural world at an alarming rate. So what's sustainable about that growth? Well, clearly nothing. So I think this part of goal number 8 needs a rewrite. It needs to be clearly redefined. It needs to be reworded and expressed within planetary boundaries, and certainly within the 1.5 degrees, if we still think that we can make that amount. Some people think that we can't. There was a report out a few days ago that said we have 6.5 years of current emissions before we surpass that. Whatever your stance is on that, it's clear that this goal is kind of severely underexplained. So if we're going to engage with this goal, how are we going to grow our economies, carry on producing carry on consuming at this rate, but also reduce emissions. So the one thing that I wanted to talk about also is in June, the European Environment Agency produced a statement that said decoupling of economic growth and resource consumption may not be possible. So to have a statement like that and to keep this goal in its static state seems like a huge disconnect, because we clearly can't fulfill this goal. And when you think about all the companies, especially the large corporations that talk about meeting and incorporating the SDGs into their ESG reporting, how are they doing that? How is that possible? Unless perhaps with some exceptions like Patagonia, and I'm sure there are a few others. But for everybody else, for the 400 million SMEs globally, or the 5.5 SMEs just in the UK, where's the guidance for them? How are they to understand how to go forward with this growth? And so one of the things I thought, well, what if we did get a complete rewrite of this goal and it was all laid out for us? How would they do that for each kind of strata of society that we're aiming it at? So we're looking at national governments, local governments, councils, large multinationals, and those SMEs that I'm talking about. So that all means different things to those different types of organizations. And there's been lots of stuff in and around degrowth, green growth, post-growth. There's lots of scholarship on that, and there's lots of groups that are talking about that. So really, I think to summarize, what I find confusing is that there's absolutely no guidance in and around this goal, despite all the recent updates from different agencies talking about how it's not possible. And given the current climate crisis, I think we need a deep dive into this if we're to get any progress on it.
Great, thank you very much, Victoria, and very detailed on SDG 8 as well. Carter, if you'd like to pick it up there, and again, for everybody, any sort of generally, SDG comments at the beginning, sort of review ones, and then coming into, your own personal opinion, that's great.
Thanks, Ed. I mean, the element that's present in every SDG, the beginning of every SDG, are people. People don't fall from the sky, we create them. And we can choose to create them in conditions that comply with the Children's Rights Convention, which we should, or we can choose to exploit them for economic growth. And when you read about alarmism about reduced fertility rates, that's because that's a threat to economic growth. It's not a threat to democracy. It's not a threat to nations. It's not a threat to human rights. Smaller families can ensure that parents can provide more for children. Smaller families reflect delay in parenting. That could mean parental readiness. It could mean geographic relocation to areas where there's less likelihood of hunger, better education, less impact on the climate. Delay can mean redistribution of resources that eliminate child inequity. And eliminating child inequity eliminates inequity between adults. So we can choose who the we is at the beginning of every of the SDGs. And the reason that we're in this crisis is because governments took a risk and they chose to define that we as economic inputs, not as people whom we would want to prepare for functional democracies. And I think the way to resolve the problem is to say that doing that, choosing to ignore the conditions in which children are born and raised in favor of riding the wave of growth to create concentrations of wealth, that act inflicted harm on future generations, disparate harm on economically disadvantaged classes, absolutely disparate harm on the global South. So if we're going to pay compensation for that harm, and we need to bend the arc of growth to qualitatively become the people that the Children's Rights Convention envisions we should be, one way to do it is through paying family planning incentives and entitlements that change family planning behavior and really result in better conditions for children. In stark terms, that essentially means taxing the wealthy class in order to offset the advantages their children would have in order to invest in children of lower income to give them better lives. And that's doable on its face. It's the just thing to do. It does bend the arc of growth significantly to get us towards what Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge saw as an optimal human population range between 500 million and 5 billion, 3 billion less than the birthday that Ed mentioned in the beginning. And so it's very doable. It's just a matter of politics. I think I'll end by saying, well, you know, at COP27, there was no indication that governments would do this. Well, we don't need governments to do this. This is a human rights matter. Citizens can demand redistribution to change the way they plan families to get us on this qualitative arc towards justice. And that sort of action has been occurring through Extinction Rebellion and other groups to try to change climate policy. It could certainly be used to change family policy. And I'll end by saying the Fair Start movement is making an example of a particular family here in the United States called the Raymond family, the family that held really the leadership at the Exxon Corporation for the 20 key years that they were burying all of the science on the climate crisis. And we're saying, look, the hundreds of millions of dollars you made inflicting harm on future generations, especially the global South, you don't really own that money. You don't own the money because we never complied with the first condition of the SDGs, being the democratic we that the Children's Rights Convention required. And so you should pay that money towards families in the Amboseli in Kenya that are now dying in the drought in order to protect their children. We think it's a human right that overrides governmental policy, and we think it's a way to get back on track towards the SDGs, which I agree with Steve, are fine as long as we comply with the first condition. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Carter. And just before Naomi starts, I mean, and everybody on here will probably know, but Scientists Warning Europe are rather unusual in terms of the non-population focus groups that very much recognize population as one of the issues that is affecting us on the planet, and we're not afraid to get into the debate and talk on that. So that's very much one part of what Scientists Warning Europe does. For today, we will almost certainly refer to it again as we have the 8th billionth person born today, but if we can get as much as we can get general on the SDGs, that would be fantastic. And moving now, Naomi, and particularly to say, if you'd like to do your introduction, but I was just thinking, knowing your background, in the introductory part, maybe before you get onto your view, Steve was talking more about SMEs using the SDGs for what they're doing. Maybe you could make a comment from bigger business and using the SDGs, and then move into your own opinion on it. That would be wonderful.
Absolutely, Ed. I've got to be honest, I think bigger companies can often use the SDGs as a smokescreen for inaction and to make it look like they're doing something. And it's very challenging to be a consultant in that space because all of our lives depend on this. It's not something that we can have greenwashed. This is about human extinction. This is about planetary extinction if we don't get this right. And what I found as a development scientist is I absolutely agree with all of the points that have been made from all of the speakers that have spoken previously. My main concern is the Sustainable Development Goals are out of date. They were written at a time where we hadn't necessarily seen this velocity of environmental and humanitarian collapse. So if you think of this summer, for example, in the UK and Ireland, where we saw weather temperatures increasing and we lost 30 years of climate models, 30 years. So Sustainable Development Goals that you set, thinking you had all of this time, are now obsolete. And I guess this goes back to the bigger question in terms of what do we mean even by sustainable development? That's what a lot of people ask me. And when we talk about sustainable development, we mean meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Can we actually say with any kind of confidence that anybody is doing that? Have any of us been able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations? The answer is no, in my opinion. And I think this is where it goes to a much bigger conversation around development science. And I don't know if there's any other development scientists on the call, and perhaps some of the attendees are, but you know, in my mind, the purpose of development is a rise in the level and quality of life in a population. We haven't seen that for the vast majority of the global population. And if we think about development as a process that's supposed to create growth, progress, positive change, with the addition of physical, economic, environmental, social, and demographic components, then it's clear to see how development science has actually led us into collapse pathways, because the focus has been on growth. And this is, to echo the sentiments of all of the other speakers, this is why I see that the Sustainable Development Goals are in no way sustainable. It's the antithesis of sustainability. So that's why, in my mind, I don't think these help us anymore. And I don't think having these frameworks are enabling businesses to actually take action. And it's not just businesses, right? It's also government. The amount of work that goes into actually organizing conferences and citizens' assemblies around these things is huge. The climate clock clearly tells us we have 6 years, just over 6 years, until we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is a point of societal collapse and runaway climate change starting. So when we have 6 years, we don't have time to work within supranational frameworks anymore, in my mind. We should just be doing absolutely everything that we can. And that's where I'd agree with Carter's suggestion in terms of having more of a rights-based approach, both a human rights approach as well as a rights of nature approach, and treating nature with the same level of respect as we would a human being.
Great, thanks very much, Naomi. And almost everybody has talked about growth, so I'm not going to avoid it. We'll be coming back to it because I think we'll have a lot to say on growth and economic growth. I'd like to come to Victoria though and say, Victoria, aren't we being a bit negative about all of the SDGs? I mean, really, aren't they just a great list of how we should be living, should be organising? And if we actually did all of them, ticked all the boxes, actually life would be pretty wonderful, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be fantastic. Yeah, let's just do that. So it comes down to the simplification of having to produce a set of parameters that the whole world follows. And that's basically never going to work. And I think we have to accept that. But as Steve says, we have to start somewhere. We have to have something, because let's face it, they're not going to get rewritten. Nobody in the UN is now going to sit down and dedicate their time to redefining every single goal for the here and now. I completely agree with Naomi. When these were set, in January in 2016, really the environment wasn't even in the MDGs. It wasn't there. And it was very much focused in these set of goals. But of course, we couldn't have known we did know the non-linear structure of climate impacts, but we couldn't have realized how fast this was happening. I think it's shocked everybody. So yes, I think we still need them as overarching goals, but I don't think we can wait for governments or governing bodies to do anything. And this is one of the reasons why I like to go on panels like this and talk about it, is that I think the responsibility lies with ourselves. And one of the things that I always want to emphasize when I talk to people is, from this couple of hours and from everything that we've spoken about and listened to, what are you going to go away and do yourself in terms of actual action? There is no point in sitting here talking about it till the cows come home, because we've kicked this can down the road for 150 years and we've not got much road left. So when we're talking about growth, which is one of the main themes it seems to be of this, you have to think about, within your sphere of influence, you have to rewrite this for what it means to you. So as a citizen, of course, we're all told to consume less and all these things that we're familiar with that we need to do. But if we're in a working environment, how do we take those values and we take them into work? And whether that's goods or services, especially manufacturing, we need to really think about what kind of change we will take into our business or corporation, and how we will also influence the sector as well. Because change comes from every level. There are things that governments can do that we can try and influence, but we only have a certain amount of power. There's the things that we can do ourselves, which we have a huge amount of influence over, and we certainly have influence within our business or community indeed as well. So it would be great if everybody just did as they were told and worked towards these goals, but that's not the nature of capitalism. That's not the nature of GDP. We have to have discussions whether we grow or degrow. And if it's nuanced, what do we degrow? Do we degrow parts of the economy that are using up all the lithium that we're going to need for the electric batteries and energy storage? And do we really focus on the parts of the economy that we need to grow? So clean energy. And so it's
I'm just going to stop you there because I don't want to get growth too early on, because it sounds like we could go down that one and speak about it all day. So I want to come to Steve. Victoria started with Victoria there a little bit about whether this is like what everybody should be doing, and really it's just a great list of good stuff that we should all be doing. When it comes to SMEs, if you've got a business with only 2 or 3 people in it, you certainly don't have time to come up with a charter of yourself, all the things you concentrate on. So when you're talking about SMEs, and I don't want to go economic on this one, we'll come to economic and growth specifically, that's clearly a topic, so stay away from that just for the next few minutes. But when we're not looking at the economic and sustainable growth part of it, where should SMEs be looking on this? Is this a good, useful list for SMEs? Should we be reducing it? How should SMEs be using this?
In my experience, SMEs find it a really useful way of thinking about and beginning to tackle the issues. However, businesses, as us as individuals, need to be focused always on the action. We can think about the policy issues, we can think about the research, we can think about all this clever stuff, which is quite frankly way above my pay grade. But for me, it boils down to what am I going to do differently and how am I going to do it? And not tomorrow or next week or next year or when someone else gives me permission, but today. So I'm not fatalistic. I genuinely believe we can do stuff. And if little me, working from home effectively can help unlock 37 million days of help in the last few years, then there is still absolutely hope for us all, as it were. I'll give you one example of something that happened to me today and how I chose to respond to it. Because with all of these things, there's all this stuff going on in the world, and it's always about how do we choose to respond. So I was taking my wife for an eye test. She had to have eye drops in, so she needed me to bring her back. She wouldn't be able to drive afterwards. We were in Leeds city centre today. It was chucking it down with rain, and a homeless person asked me if I would give them some money for a cup of coffee. Now, as a matter of choice, I don't like to do that because you don't know whether that's actually going to be a cup of coffee or used for some other much more harmful purpose. So what I have created for me is a response to that. That's a trigger, as it were. Every time I see a homeless person, I do the following. I provide at least one homeless person with a meal. And in fact, today, because something had happened, I got a little refund on something I wasn't expecting to. I had a little bit more money that came in than I was anticipating. So I was able to respond to seeing that homeless person by funding 100 meals for homeless people. Now, I did that through a charity that rescues food from restaurants that would otherwise be thrown away, go into landfill, emit gases that would need a whole new load of food to be grown instead of that thrown away food. It's rescued from restaurants by volunteers, and it's repackaged and made safe and then given to people that need it on the streets of American cities. Net cost of each one of those meals, 12 cents. So 100 meals cost me $12. So my response to seeing a homeless person, instead of giving them a few pounds, which they might have done goodness knows what with, was to add a few more pounds to it because I'd had this little refund and fund 100 days of help for other homeless people. Not the one I met, but somewhere else in the world. This weighing scales of the good stuff that happens in the world and the bad stuff has just been tipped ever so slightly by that micro behavior. That's not a random behavior. That's a choice I have made as the way that I live a life for good. I choose that when I see a homeless person, it reminds me that actually there's something I can do. Now, that's a trigger response, but actually I sat down and thought, what's the thing that is most important to me? Another day of health and happiness, living in the good fortune we have to be here in the UK and with all the comforts and privileges and democratic rights, etc., etc. So I have a daily habit, which is every single day I give to 17 specific projects. And I've chosen 17 for a reason. There are 17 global goals. 2 of those involve planting trees. One of those trees is I'm funding the planting of a tree. Obviously, I'm not physically going out every single day and planting 2 different trees, one of which is in Kenya, but I'm funding the planting of a mango tree in Kenya, which will not only sequester some carbon in due course, but actually it yields fruit, which tackles poverty, and the surplus fruit and tackles hunger, and the surplus fruit can be sold to tackle poverty as well as sequestering carbon. So, and I have 17 of those things that I do every single day. Now, the last few days, we were away, and so I wasn't able to do that. So today I did 5 days worth to catch up. But it's a daily habit. These are daily responses, another good day of health, another set of actions, which makes a little bit of a difference. And I just see the world as a set of weighing scales. There's all this bad stuff that we see and hear all the time, and we can just fractionally, through micro impacts, tip the balance back the other way by doing some good stuff, by responding to that in the ways that we could. And I've been doing this 17 things, 17 impacts a day approach for the last 3 years. And in fact, it started at the beginning of our first lockdown here in the UK. I could no longer go out and spend money in coffee shops and all those other things that we used to do because we weren't even allowed to leave home, were we? So instead of, I just chose to use that money differently. And I think that's the bottom line. There isn't an endless pot of global resources, and we have used growth. We've hidden behind growth as a way of not making the difficult choices. The difficult choices are about redistribution, aren't they? We have to accept that we will have less. I have a little bit less because I've given 100 meals and planted, some trees and done 15 other things today, 17 in total. We have to accept that we're going to have less, and we've hidden behind growth to try and get away with not accepting that. But we do have to accept that. But let's build it into our habits, and let's find a way of finding joy and purpose from those new habits, those habits of generosity and kindness and caring and sustainable behaviors, rather than getting fatalistic about it. I think when it's what I call a life for good, and we can take the same principles in our businesses slightly differently, but we can use them. We can change the habits and systems of our businesses. So, for example, and I always use these 2 little bits of paper to make this point. Just imagine if in a small business, every single time something good happened that moved the business forward, that unlocked something good that moved the world forward. So that progress in our business also resulted in progress in the world. So specifically, just imagine every time a business sold something, they chose to plant a tree, or every time they hit a mark. They could decide what are the triggers, the things that represent progress in the business. And instead of keeping all of that progress for themselves, what if they used a little bit of it to share, to make the world a better place, using the SDGs as a framework for understanding where to focus their efforts, and as a way of measuring the difference that they've made, the impact that they've created. That's the little idea that's in my book. That's the little idea that I share with businesses, and it will only make one little difference at a time. But if every business did that, if every human being had that kind of mentality, imagine how it would start to shift the weighing scales.
Steve, I'm so pleased we've got you on, so positive and practical at the same time. And I, oddly enough, looked at the issue you're talking about, but oddly enough, I think in a slightly negative way, because being that I've been elected as a councillor, knocking on doors, and I hear people talking about climate change, and they'd all tell me they were doing their bit, until it drove me mad. And I had to go and say to them, you're doing your bit, you need to do a little bit more every day, because doing your bit won't be enough. But you've talked about it so eloquently and really in a positive, inspiring way. So thanks very much. Now, Naomi, you're going to keep you on the positive and inspiring here, Naomi. So no off track for this question, just for a few seconds. So let's say we're taking that up to bigger business, so away from individuals and SMEs now, and let's look positively. And I know your overall view is it can be used for greenwashing, but where's the good that's come? So let's look at what good has happened in big businesses because of the SDGs. Is there any, and what's there been?
I think there definitely is. I mean, they are, as Steve has said, they're a great talking point, and that in itself is the hardest thing within climate change, right? Having courageous conversations around climate is nearly taboo, if I'm honest. And a lot of the time when I go into businesses, they'll say to me, this is the first time we've actually really spoken about this, and we've really had a heart-to-heart about it. So that will show you how big businesses might have these big overlying goals, but they're not actually having the conversations within their team meetings, for example. So I think the fact that they're even starting the conversation is great. I think it's also led to much bigger questions from executive leadership, and that's who I tend to work with the most, is executives, because the change needs to happen both from a bottom-up perspective and a top-down. And what I've heard leaders talk about the most is how they've realized they need to decolonize themselves. So that's huge, Ed. That is, I mean, decolonizing development, decolonizing business, and decolonizing ourselves. That is the socio-cultural change that needs to happen in order for all of this to shift. So in that sense, there has been, they're a very good tool in terms of flipping the conversation.
Great. And I'm going to bring in just a question somebody's put in. I'm going to get you to answer it, Naomi, in 20, 30 seconds. I'm going to Steve for the same 20 or 30 on this particular one. Isn't the best way for business to look at it is take your 17, take one, concentrate on it, get it done. As soon as that's in progress, move to the next one. Is that the best way for big business? Then we'll ask Steve the same for SME.
Yes and no. The problem looking at it in a silo is you may have unintended consequences, which is what we often find. If we just concentrate on one thing, it might impact another SDG. So I would never recommend that. I would always recommend trying to have some kind of an overview plan. And then, of course, you can drill down and focus on one, but it's important to have some kind of a overall strategy with all of the SDGs.
You almost sound like a politician there. So don't concentrate on one, go general and then drill down. Okay. So having both things. Steve, from SME's point of view, one and then move to others?
Well, I covered it from a slightly different perspective in that I think it's one of the things which I think businesses need to do is do this in a way that's visible, because we can all be good in private, in secret, but then we don't inspire others to follow our leadership. So we have to find a way of telling the story and letting others know what we're doing in a way that's sufficiently humble, so it's not arrogant, but it's inspiring others to change their behavior too. And so I find that the best way of doing that is for business to sit down with their team, SMEs to sit down as a team and decide, first off, which specific, and it may be 2, 3, 4, 5, which specific projects or areas resonate most to us. So they come up with their shortlist, and everything they do within that shortlist is going to resonate and drive and energize and motivate the team. And then, having engaged them in that, then, for example, if my idea is, you send out an invoice, you plant a tree. Well, actually, rather than you send out an invoice, you plant a tree, you send out the invoice and you invite the recipient of the invoice to pick from 5 projects the one that most resonates with them, and then they're engaged and they feel a sense of ownership and contribution, and they feel some of that joy rather than it being inflicted on them. They might not want to plant a tree, they might want to provide solar heating for a family so they don't have to burn fossil fuels or whatever it is. So I find that when you engage both the team in choosing the first set of options and then engage the other person, be it the customer, the supplier, then you've got much more engagement, you've got much more buy-in, you've got much more ownership, and therefore you've got much greater chance of it sticking and it growing and leveraging from that and inspiring others.
Brilliant. Yes, great. Now, Carter, I can see you've been itching to get in there. So I'm going to put you on the spot now, and let's bring in some of the stuff from what everybody's been saying into one area. And pardon me if I'm going to be slightly provocative for you, Carter, to get it going. So you're concentrating on population, and it's 8 billion people on the planet today. Okay. And I've seen quite a few comments on that as well, and questions. Now, if we're looking at the 17 SDGs, and and population overlaps with quite a few of them, wouldn't that, though, isn't that really irrelevant for the moment? And the reason is if we're taking out 1 or 2 SDGs that are most important, shouldn't we, and now going back to, I think everyone's commented in a different way about this, we've got no time to try and stop ourselves going over 1.5 degrees. We've got no time left to ensure that we don't lose those global tipping points, Arctic ice shelves, permafrost, with methane release, without going into what the effect could be of that. So, and that is caused by the temperature going up. The temperature going up is caused by greenhouse gases going out, particularly CO2 and methane. So shouldn't we firstly be concentrating right on that, forget the population stuff for the moment, and concentrate only on that? And then just to add into that before you answer, so there's the second part, which is biodiversity and nature. So quite clearly, we can't live on this planet. We've got no pollinators. We can't live if we destroy all the soils. We can't live if we've got absolutely no fish left and all that sort of thing. So in terms of a hierarchy, and this is why I'm drawing it onto you, because you're particularly interested in the population aspect of it, is if we don't solve stopping the temperature going up and the carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere as number one, everything else is irrelevant. Now, if we do solve that, we then have to solve SDGs, and I think it's probably 14 and 15, but on water and nature, because if we don't put those right, again, everything else we do will become irrelevant. How would you respond to that?
I don't think it's inconsistent to think about that in terms of population. I mean, I think, so if you wanted to limit emissions, one way you could do it is by bringing a court case to obligate a business or a government to reduce its emissions because not doing so is a violation of human rights. Well, the question then arises, what human rights are we talking about? Well, it might be the right of future generations to a restored environment in which governments are operating at 280 or less parts per million emissions. So that could be consistent with the view of population. Why? Future generations have a right to restored climate, restored environment. We sue Exxon to say, you and the United States government are colluding to exceed those emissions, which violate future generations' right. In a way, population is a misnomer because that atomizes people. You think of it as individuals. In fact, what we're talking about are the power relations between those atomized points. That's what really matters. And that's consistent, I think, Ed, with your point on biodiversity. If future generations have a right to a restored environment, and Phoebe's a master at that sort of thing, it's also because they have a right to live in a world that's biodiverse. They have a right to nature, which is consistent with nature itself having rights, which is consistent, again, with Partha Dasgupta's optimality of 500 million to 5 billion people. And again, I'll end by saying, again, that sort of implies in our minds these atomized points. Dasgupta is talking about people whose power relations, the relationships between those points, the people, reflect the conditions that the SDGs called for. They reflect the conditions that the Children's Rights Convention calls for. So, and the last thing I'll say is I really appreciate Steve's point about modeling great behavior. That's in fact how we bent the arc of growth. Primarily, go check out girlplanet.earth, another Phoebe effort. But if you'll see people modeling better family planning behavior. You can do that around population. That's how we got it done through role modeling. The only thing I would add is that one other thing we can model is redistribution of wealth. Steve's already doing it on a micro scale. And if we did that in the context of homelessness, and I put something in the chat, recognizing that, as the Lancet found, one of the main drivers of homelessness is adverse childhood experiences. If we thought about delay, preparation, better family planning, we could be tackling all of this by changing who we are becoming, in part by role modeling. So I think that hopefully that answers some of the question, Ed.
Yes, no, that's great. Thanks, Carl. So danced around part of it, but answered the other half. So that was great. Thank you. Victoria, coming to you then. Put simply, Victoria, shouldn't we dump 16 of the SDGs, just focus on the climate one, get it solved, nothing else matters?
The problem with the SDGs, it's like a game of chess, isn't it? So you move one and then you lose the other one and then one gets knocked out. They're all relevant and they're all out of date, but to a certain extent, they all work. If you focus on one, you can't help affect the other ones. And so if we're talking about global biodiversity loss, 80% of resource use and extraction is responsible for that biodiversity loss. So that's growth and production and consumption related to the natural environment. And then that's related to poverty, that's related to population, that's related to the developing world, colonization of the global south by the global north, just on resources alone, let alone anything else. So it's a really, the problem with them is that they're so nuanced and difficult to extract from each other that you can't just focus on one thing. You have to take that holistic view. And whether you're a citizen, a government, or an organization, I think the thing to do is to look at where you have the most influence. And a lot of SMEs and indeed large corporations have a huge amount of influence over their value chain. So you set your intentions as a business. This is what you would like to do, cause the least amount of harm for future generations. And then you look at your value chain and you ask, where are the inputs coming from? How can I be, or if we're manufacturing, how can we go from linear to circular? And how can we do that through influencing positively the value chain? And so then they look at their value chain upstream and downstream. And so that's how I feel in terms of on a larger scale, you have more positive influence in the business world.
Great, thanks very much, Victoria. And just before I go on, I hope everybody realizes in trying to get the conversation going, I'm not necessarily representing the exact views of Scientists Warning Europe or myself in asking these particular questions. And on that moment, Naomi, let's come in. You were talking about 6.5 years left. Completely agree with you on that and can represent myself as agreeing. You know, the AR6 carbon budget for keeping us safe on the planet under 1.5 degrees. The Economist might think that it's gone, but based on what the AR6 says from the IPCC, it runs out in 2028, at least to give us a 4 in 5 chance of staying under 1.5. So on that basis, Naomi, really, shouldn't we just not deal with any of the rest of these SDGs? Let's focus on keeping that temperature down. You said yourself, after 6.5 years, we haven't done it, we've had it pretty much. So we've got to get the temperature down. Now, I would just add in there a nuance for you on this one, is it's definitely true that if we don't solve the nature and water ones, then we're not going to have a planet anyway. But both the nature and water ones, we can't solve them if the temperature goes up. So yeah, we can plant as many trees as we like. We can try and do things in the oceans. We can try and do stuff with wetlands, but none of it will be good enough if we keep pumping 40 or 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere all the time. So I'm just put it to you then, Naomi, to top off this topic then, is shouldn't we just forget the rest of them, get on with the climate change one because the rest won't matter, or maybe go climate change, spend a bit of time on water and biodiversity, forget the rest? Is that what we should be doing?
That's a really difficult question, Ed. I think this is where you have to look at the nature of the planetary polycrisis. If we look at things, looking at things in silos is what got us to this point. And this is where, if we look at the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and how that overlaps with the economic crisis we face and the humanitarian crisis. It's the intersectionality of all of that that we need to be looking at, and particularly the real world evidence. And this is where I have problems with frameworks, because it's not necessarily reflective of now. We need to be looking at now. The time is now, and doing absolutely everything that we can. And I think having an ethics-based approach of, you know, similar to that in medicine, first do no harm. You know, if we had more of an ethical approach to the way we were working and stopped hiding behind these frameworks, I think we would see much more progress. And for myself, that's why I've decided I'm stepping away completely from consultancy and any other work, because there is no point sitting as a scientist writing white papers or writing reports for companies who aren't really acting. I think that's where we have to say enough is enough, and we can talk all we want, but now is the time for action. So I am just going to dedicate all of my time to activism going forward.
Can I just draw you out though onto it? Is it just climate first, then water and nature, and forget the rest, or should we be thinking about the rest at all? I mean, I think Victoria's view was, although there are concentrations, we really should consider the rest of it. I think Steve's is that if we're all taking actions in different areas and inspiring people in different areas, and we keep doing that, we'll also get there. Do you think, because we've only got 6.5 years, just deal with the one or the three and forget the rest?
I think we've got to focus on them. I think we've got to you know, there has to be, we can't do everything, and it's just not feasible at this stage. You know, I'm a transformation consultant. If I look at what a multinational company needs to do to have a merger and acquisition, they need a 3-year timeline for that, and they are throwing all of the money in the world that they have at it. It's not going to be a case that we can do everything. We do need to try to ensure that there is a just transition for everyone affected, But we have to be realistic about this at this stage. Given the emergency of the situation, it is not going to be possible to deal with all of these SDGs.
Okay, right, Ed, could I just chip in my 2 pennies worth as well? In my experience, having had lots of conversations over the last literally hundreds and hundreds of one-to-one and one-to-small group conversations with business owners and individuals, there are, amongst the 17 global goals, different ones of them inspire different people. Now, if I were to say to them, you must focus on global goal 13, I might get 40, 50 out of 100 who take any kind of action. The others would be turned off. If I say there are 17, pick the one or pick the ones that resonate most to you, that seem most important, I can end up getting 99 people taking action. So, but rather than being prescriptive, understanding human behavior and the need to feel a sense of ownership and control and personal relevance and resonance and what I'm ready for yet, what I'm ready to believe or understand or take action on, I just think we will get more people taking action if at an individual level, we allow them to make those choices. Policy level, we've obviously got to set priorities, and that's got to be driven by the science and the urgency and et cetera. But at an individual engagement level, rather than insisting people do X, give them a choice of the 17.
Okay, and just before we move on, so let's stay on that. And I'm going to come to Carter and then Victoria just for a few seconds on this, but we're going to stay off your pet topics. And we're just going to come to comment on this. And isn't actually Steve right? Because honestly, if all of us dedicated ourselves to dealing with climate, wouldn't we get in the way of each other? Everything else would collapse. We wouldn't get anything else done. It'd be a pretty horrible place to live, even though we'd solved climate. So going away from the first thing that I drew Naomi out on, yeah, we have to do climate, but don't we need people working on all the other areas as well at the same time? Carter first. You're muted.
Sorry about that, Ed. I think a historical example would be useful. When the Black Lives Matter movement launched in the United States realizing that all the attempts to prevent police from killing Black men had largely failed, the pivot point in that movement largely happened around their deciding to cross highways and to block traffic, essentially. And now it's a tactic that's being emulated in some ways by Extinction Rebellion and others. I think that if the move to end subsidization and use of fossil fuels were to engage in that sort of radical action, and they had a critical mass of people, I think you might end up getting the sufficient attention of governments and the populace to make a change. So in that sense, I'm sort of behind Naomi 100%, that you may need something like the historical precedent of Black Lives Matter crossing highways to make a change to ending oil group is trying to do now. So I don't think we get in the way. I think there will be enough people doing it to bend the arc.
So sort of you're saying is that we need our focus groups on it, including the extreme groups that are going out and being on the edge of the law, potentially breaking the law to do it. But we have others working on some of the other stuff behind the scenes anyway.
100%, and there's more than enough evidence in social science research to show that what's called a radical flank effect does in fact change policy. The radical flank moves the moderates essentially, and it works.
Victoria, so same sort of question to you. So focus on the one, but we don't get in each other's way. But also I'd like to bring in a question that's just come through the chat. So somebody in the chat has suggested, actually, let's not put carbon first. So let's focus on, the nature one first. Let's deal with biodiversity first because of the opportunity for sinks. And let's put climate into the second or third place. So either way around, focus on one or the wider spread. But also, what do you think? Nature or climate first?
The thing is, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you do, whatever you focus on, whether that's healthy lives, well-being, ending poverty, end hunger, end emissions going up, resource use, all of them, they're all linked. And if you think about how are they all linked, what effect do we have that affects all of those goals, even if we just cared about one or two of them? The thing that we all do is we consume. That's the unifying factor. We produce stuff and we consume it. at an unfair rate, at an unfair price. So whatever one we like and whatever one we want to pick on, say it's end poverty, that will be linked to fair wages, that will be linked to equality and justice and all the rest of it. So yeah, pick your favorite goal if that's what you want to do. If that's what inspires you to action, then that's amazing. But it will affect emissions, it will affect production, that will affect biodiversity, that will affect the resource use. So whatever motivates you to action, I'm all for, but it doesn't really matter where you focus because they're also linked.
Okay, just to bring in a comment then, but we're going to move on to growth now. So everybody hold on to your seats because this should be interesting. But Rosalind came in and Rosalind actually said pretty much like what you said, but she said, look, we've got to focus on fossil fuels first, because if we don't, the rest will not be as important. And I think she was mentioning that we need our politicians to get it on the fossil fuels and move forward. And then the rest of us can actually, you know, do some of the other things as well. Okay, let's come and tackle the growth one. So, and I want to take it now into, let's pull it apart for a second from global and national, okay? Because, and let's take it to a national level to begin with. And I think we'll use the UK as the example, Carter, if that's okay, but it doesn't matter. It's single country. So why don't we, in terms of growth, if we focused a single country on decarbonising by 2030, okay, and then we said that that's going to lead to growth. Okay, so we actually focus everybody, and let's be honest, our politicians and many members of the public are pretty interested in growth. They're pretty interested in growth in their pocket, growth in the economy, financial growth. But we decarbonise the economy by 2030. So we prioritise decarbonisation. Once we've got a decarbonised economy, haven't we solved a lot of the other issues anyway? So by decarbonising your economy, you've got rid of extractive growth to a large degree, because you can't continue to extract, because extraction causes carbon emissions currently. By decarbonising your economy completely, you're inevitably in a more sustainable circular form in the future. You've probably localised. You've done a whole load of the other bits and pieces because we think they're joined at the hip in order to get to a decarbonised economy. And you will actually potentially see after that, if you decarbonise first, and then you sell on all your innovations to everybody else around the world, you'll see an economic uplift. But it needn't be an extractive uplift. It could be a financial uplift that is based on a decarbonised economy that's fully sustainable. So we've been talking about growth. So let's put it to everybody here, and we'll go around. And I think we'll start with Naomi on this one. So can we look at an area where, and we've all heard, and probably many of the people on have heard the arguments between green growth, degrowth, et cetera, et cetera. But let's look at it in these circumstances. So Britain goes for it. We're completely decarbonised by 2030. Doesn't that mean we can have growth afterwards that's good, that is sustainable, and that we can keep going and it's not destroying the planet? Naomi, would you like to start?
It's a great question, Ed. I think this is where we need to understand that there's going to be decades-long and centuries-long impacts from all of this. And I think Finland's philosophy has been the one that's really stood out to me in terms of national policy making. And Finland are actually ahead of all of the other countries in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So their approach was to focus on climate and biodiversity first, and to try to transition their economy to a circular economy. So by emphasizing reusing, recycling, repairing, streamlining existing resources, they've actually changed the fundamental way that their economy is working. And let's be honest, we've got to do this. In terms of economic impact, Swiss Re, the biggest reinsurance group in the world, came out last year and said that we are basically coming to a point of an uninsurable world. When the biggest reinsurance company in the world say that to us, we all need to listen, because they insure our pensions. They insure mortgages. You know, it's not just the banks who are going to be affected by this. And their what they were forecasting was, if we stayed on the current emission path, we would lose minus 18.5% of global GDP by 2050. Now that is a torpedo to our global economy. So if we don't start shifting our economies to well-being economies, and the likes of Finland, where they have transitioned to a circular economy, our economies are going to collapse because they cannot withstand that kind of an impact.
Naomi, so it's, I just draw you there, and just to try and stay away from global for a second, because a lot of these events, we all talk about global, and oddly enough, most of us can't affect global terribly much. So coming back to single country, so should we literally be making it so simple? Let's decarbonize the UK by 2030, and after that, we can have growth because it won't be damaging.
I think we have to decarbonize, but I think after that we can't have growth. I mean, then you're just going back into the same post-colonial society and culture that got us into this problem. Okay. So we have to.
Sure, I just wanted to draw you out on it. Now I'm going to swing to Victoria. So Naomi's given us the introduction, much of which is obviously completely correct. Victoria, if we're completely decarbonized by 2030. Don't we then effectively have a sustainable economy, a circular economy, one that's not damaging the planet? And if we get financial growth, it's not extractive. So isn't that a good thing?
It depends. It's an empirical question because nobody really knows. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how are we defining growth in the future? Do we keep to GDP, which is quite an inflammatory marker, because obviously the more bad things that happen in society, the better the GDP is? Or do we switch to genuine progress indicator, and do we map our well-being and our growth on that instead of GDP?
Can I pull you there just for a second? And we'll come to well-being, definitely, which is very important. But let's just assume we stick with something close to GDP. And I know GDP is a bit about the pile of stuff you can create, because that's sort of what GDP is. But if we take it on a much more, basic level, financial growth. So let's talk about it's just money. So actually, we could have more money in our pockets, and we could have businesses making money on the 1st of January 2031 and after, but it's no longer extractive. Sticking just to that sort of businessy financial bit, and we'll come on to well-being, which I think is a great point. Do you think that would be that would work? Do you think we could have a society that ran successfully like that?
If we tackle the capital accumulation distribution problem that we have. So in theory, I think, yes, that would be possible, as long as that growth and the capital from that growth is distributed fairly across the population.
Okay, great. Coming around to Steve now. So effectively, we're sticking on the same question, quite like all of your inputs so on it. So we're talking about Steve. We've come now to the 1st of January 2031. We're totally decarbonised in the UK. And I could see a comment from somebody coming in, what about our imports? Yeah, I'm assuming that we've got carbon taxes and things that are making our imports completely decarbonised as well. But if we've decarbonised, have we done enough? Are we sustainable? Are we circular? Would that solve a lot of our problems? And in fact, would it solve a lot of the other SDGs that are linked to it at the hip?
I can't answer that from an economic or scientific perspective at all. Just don't have the competence. However, this is my perspective on it. Addicted to growth, I think it's twofold. Firstly, because it avoids the more difficult redistributive questions. We don't have to tackle them because we can fund it out of growth. But secondly, because we have trained ourselves to feel that having more stuff, more money, more stuff, more resources, it feels good. We need to switch our focus to feeling good about other things that then takes away the need to have more stuff, and yet we still feel better. So, I feel good. I felt good today when I helped those 100 people get those 100 homeless folk in America get fed somewhere down the line. If we can switch our focus, from, I could have spent that $12 on something else that conventionally would have made me feel good, some toy of some kind, which would have extracted products out, minerals out of the ground and wasted them probably. But if we can change what we feel, that we could put our values and our humanity and kindness at the core of what drives our satisfaction, then suddenly the whole economic question, and I'm not articulating this very well, but I hope you get what I mean. I think it's what drives us at the moment is we believe we need more. And that's where happiness comes from. And maybe I've gone into the wellness space, I don't know. But I think we need to replace that with appreciating that other things ultimately, because how many times have we heard, people say towards the end of their life, I didn't put enough value on my health. It's only now I appreciate how much that matters when it's too late. And we need to, it's the equivalent kind of focus socially, I think, economically.
Great. I mean, we wandered back into the well-being, which is absolutely fine. I'm going to slightly change it now for you, Carter, and move it around just a little bit. So we're looking at our decarbonisation by 2030, but actually what we're going to do is, as everyone suggested, it would be great, and I think we all agree that actually well-being is really what we're after, and we probably all agree that. But let's just imagine, though, that we've only got the 6.5 years left that Naomi's given us. We've only got 6.5 years. Are we going to get all of the voters? Are we going to get all of the consumers? Are we going to get all of the politicians? And are we going to get all of the businessmen to start saying that well-being is the number one thing we should be doing? Or are they still going to be focused on growth, in inverted commas, however that is defined? And so we come back to, if the most important thing we need to do, and Naomi put it, 6.5 years, we've got to get climate issues solved. We've got to bring global warming down. If we've got to do that, shouldn't we be focusing everybody on something which, sorry, not everyone, a lot of people already understand, which is prosperity based on financial improvement and growth in a GDP sense. And then we do it decarbonized, because that's what everybody understands. We don't have time to convert everybody into thinking more like Steve and Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, so Japan has now entered negative population growth, and they still show quarters of positive GDP. Why? Because you don't have to run GDP by just dumping people into the economy in order to create essentially inflated growth. You can innovate. There are ways that you can get to growth without exploiting future generations. So if you did have a carbon tax, as one of the commenters suggested in the comments, and the carbon tax revenue was largely not just put into alternative energies, but put into developing children, preparing them for a degraded future, which would be the ethical thing to do, then I think you can have growth, even in the sense of GDP, without relying on exploiting people to do it. And the last thing I'll say is, that said, you want to be a little careful, Ed. You know, the reason that I think the reason that world leaders decided to live with exponential growth in the 20th century is because they felt like the Green Revolution was going to produce enough food to avoid the famines that really triggered people in terms of their fear about population growth. That was true, but they didn't account for the unknowns, like carbon, like methane. And now we have this problem. So if you don't, you know, one reason is you shouldn't exploit future generations to build an economy. You should, in fact, innovate. The second reason you wouldn't want population-based economic growth is you're playing with unknowns. What is the unknown besides carbon, methane, and other things that's going to screw us over in the future? We don't know. So let's not use a multiplier like population growth to multiply that unknown.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think we'll kind of come back, and we're going to have some comments on population actually again from everybody a little bit later on. Martin Earl put into the chat, Naomi, and I'm coming to Victoria on the same one afterwards, that shouldn't we be concentrating on our politicians? And not only that, and I'm coming to you actually, because everyone was saying how wonderful you sound and you should become PM. So that's why you this one first.
I don't take that as a compliment, Ed. I really don't take it as a compliment when people tell me I sound like a politician. No offense, but
so anyway, so Naomi for PM. But anyway, so Martin was suggesting that actually what we should be doing is concentrate on our politicians, get them educated, get them across the line. And not just that, we should all get engaged in politics and get on with it. So how do you think about that? Coming to Victoria straight away afterwards.
It's an excellent summary of what needs to happen. And I think when it's the number one thing that everybody needs to be doing is getting involved in politics in some way. This day last year, I was doing a video conference with the Irish climate minister coming from COP26 and his team. I never would have imagined myself having to get into a political space, nor do I feel comfortable in it. But this is bigger than me, and this is bigger than you, and we've all got to do things that we aren't necessarily comfortable with. So for that reason, I would encourage everybody to get into politics, because including young people, because really that's where we need to see the change. And what I saw from a political perspective was no politician is going to step out there and say, okay, we're going to change our economy, because they would lose votes. They would never get voted back in again. So this has to come from the citizenry. It has to come from the people. So we must demand change. We need people out on the streets. We need people protesting, and we need people demanding that this change happens now.
Thanks, Naomi. And before I come to you, Victoria, I'm sorry, I can't resist coming in now, and apologies to my colleagues at Scientists Warning Europe, because we launched the Climate Party specifically to do all that work in politics that isn't being done. So completely single focus, and sitting on the centre right. And it comes out bizarrely in what you've just said, out of an experience at COP26, where I heard Conservative Environment Network talking. Theresa May was there and Amber Rudd from the UK, and they talked about how brilliantly Britain was doing and everything else. And I got up and talked about effectively the 6.5 years. We don't have time. And what we need is government to do the heavy lifting and business will follow. And Amber Rudd just basically stood up and she just said, if any politician took 2030 as a target, they wouldn't get elected at the next election. And then she sat down. So, yeah, which is why the Climate Party now exists to a great extent. And one other quick thing is you mentioned young people, and I tend to mention this every single time I can. In England and Wales, there are 10,000 parish and town councils. 3,000 of them don't have enough councillors. So a little bit pointing it out to Martin, who was asking the question, but all of those councils could have people going and sitting on them in a week's time. We could have 3,000 councils where people go and join their parish and town council, and they then propose climate emergency declarations, or they propose a whole load of other climate or biodiversity related actions. And that could be happening tomorrow. And people can get involved in politics literally tomorrow. And then Steve talked about all of the little things we do together. If there were 3,000 parish and town councillors tomorrow all pushing on this, that's a big change coming. Victoria, would you like to come in on this one? So on us getting involved in politics and on our political leadership.
Yes, I mean, completely agree. And when you look at history in the last few centuries, it's actually only been citizen action that has made the significant changes throughout history. It hasn't come from top down. Governments, like you say, are never going to take the initiative because the short-termism of the election term in itself just completely upends that, any actions in and around that. So yes, getting involved in any way that you possibly can in politics, in individual groups, and having a voice, being really vocal about it. I really like Dr. Catherine Hayhoe when she she obviously knows all about the science, but turns to behaviour change and says, talk to your communities, talk to your leaders, talk to everybody about what you want and make yourself really vocal, because that's the only way that we're going to get change.
Great. Steve, would you like to bring in a comment here, but coming from the angle of you talked about many small actions making it up. Are those many small actions, I mean, are they any actions? Are they particular actions? Is it a bit like Naomi was saying, should we be on the street like XR? Is it as Martin was saying, should we get involved in politics? What are your feelings for how we should be doing it? Should we be picking an SDG and running with it? Whichever angle you want to take it.
I think what we need to do is galvanize as much energy and participation and action as possible. Now, in my experience, that is easier to do through inspiration than it is through demands. So that's why I said at the outset, I don't see myself as an activist, and I won't be on street corners, demanding things with placards, although I have respect for people that do that. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just in my experience, at least with my voice, I have found that I'm more effective, and it's more effective through inspiration. And that's, in other words, being the change we want to see. That's the Gandhi approach rather than the activism kind of, it's that kind of approach. So for me, that's the pathway I've chosen. But again, if we're going to, each of us must find, I think, our own pathways, the ones that energizes us most, the one that we find are most successful, and the one that we can get most enthusiastic about and create the greatest impact through. And when we do that, and there'll be different pathways and there'll be different voices and there'll be different focuses and priorities, but the combined effect will, I believe, be a better world.
Brilliant. Okay, Carter. People on the streets. Victoria's talked about the fact that all the great movements, they've had to go out and get on the streets to do it. We've had Gandhi mentioned. Effectively, we've almost referred to the suffragettes without saying it. These are movements that went out, effectively upsetted a lot of people while they were doing it, but they were ultimately successful. Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Animal Rebellion, and all these other things. Peaceful civil unrest, but often illegal. Is that where we should be going? Is that the sort of action we should be taking? Or should we be going back to the SDGs and working peacefully through our SDGs. What do we need?
I do think the radical flank moves constituents who then move their voters if it's properly organized. But I think there is a missing element here in each of the movements that you mentioned. And they're ignoring the other great crisis besides ecological, climatological crisis that we're facing, and that's inequity. It's inequity based on race. It's inequity based on birth position. And if the world is really teetering towards something like class warfare, and if you look in the United States, what looks as right versus left, it really often looks a lot like populism versus the billionaire, trillionaire class that the United States has developed by not observing planetary boundaries. I think these movements will galvanize when they hook into inequity. And how that happens, I don't know what it looks like. But I do think that is the next social movement, a bit of a changing of the classes. And if that can be geared around climatological restoration, rights of nature, and ideally about giving children a fair start, I think that would be the linchpin.
Can I just add to that, Carter? Sorry, just to add to that, Scientists Rebellion are one of the only groups that does have a social equity approach. And that is why scientists are saying, you know, we are privileged. Most of us are white. We can afford to walk out of our jobs. We can afford to, you know, we have to be those people who talk about famine and war and all of the other horrible things that are ahead of us if we don't take action now. I think that's where there is potentially going to be a huge amount of movement, because scientists also have a unique socioeconomic privilege and a sociocultural credibility that perhaps other climate activists don't have. Just to add to that.
Agreed, 100%.
I think going back to the film we just watched, the scientists are basically saying we can't shout louder in any bolder font. It now requires leadership at all those other levels, particularly political, but all those other levels to get us anywhere. Scientists have told us it all for 20, 30 years. Gosh, first scientist warning in 1992, you know, signed by 1,700 scientists, including more than half the Nobel Prize winners. What else did we need to know? You know, when the GP tells us that we're sick, we're going to die if we don't stop smoking and drinking after a year, then most of us stop smoking and drinking, or at least we cut down 90% rather than getting there. And it might be one person continues, but it seems to me that still we're 90% aren't doing that. So we're still charging towards the problem. So I very much appreciate the social inequality and the fairness issue of all this sort of thing. But in order, again, to provoke discussion on this, and I'm going to come to Victoria on this one now, if we don't cut those carbon emissions by 2028 or whenever we consider as our cutoff point, and we then see all the global tipping points go out of control, we're going to see vast tracts of the planet that we can't live on. So all of these people we'd like to be looking after now and making sure that we're being fair to them will have an even worse time. They're then going to get up, they're going to be migrating, they're going to be coming up to all the places, all of our countries, the country that we're in at the moment in the UK. And when they come here, the first group that's going to be affected by mass immigration at the point we're in chaos anyway are the lower groups. So those who are more vulnerable. So shouldn't we be forgetting about dealing with all the inequity now? As I say, these comments are not necessarily mine or Scientists Warning Europe's, but shouldn't we be forgetting about the fairness and equity now? Because the fairest thing is to solve the climate crisis, pull down those emissions, and then we deal with the rest of it later. What do you think, Victoria? And then I'm going to come back to Carter actually straight after that.
Yeah, the justice element of this is huge. And I think the prediction was 200 million refugees by 2030 if we carry on this trajectory. And we think about the Syrian crisis, that was 7.2 million refugees. And look how difficult Europe had to cope with that. And recently with Ukraine, I think it was 7 million displaced outside of Ukraine. So can you imagine 200 million? How will we deal? How will we clothe, feed, manage all of these people and keep them well? How will we deal with all these children, the integration of people? So yeah, we have to again look at it on all levels. How do we deal with this mass injustice of people having to move away from where they live because they just can't live there anymore? But equally, that affects people in this country. You know, just in the UK, we're struggling with the cost of living. And then that gives rise to kind of far right kind of sentiments. And so the whole thing is so intricate and linked that we do just need to focus on the carbon emissions, but we also need to do it in a just way. And coming back to what Naomi was saying about this kind of privilege of being able to go out into the streets and protest and potentially get arrested, that is acknowledged. And you look at kind of Just Stop Oil and all the people that are doing that. They say, you know, I'm in this position where I can go and get arrested and I can be that person. And there are so many other people that are passionate about this that can't lose their job. You know, they can't risk being deported if they get arrested, all these other things. So I think if everybody does what they can within the limits that's safe and just for them, and that can make sure it's safe and just for other people, that is the way forward. And that's what we have to do.
Just before I come to Carter, actually, and I'm going to bring in Malcolm's comment here as well on citizens' assemblies. There was a very nice comment I saw, because I'm following on TikTok and Facebook and stuff, a lot of the stuff on Just Stop Oil, and 98% of it is about that I'd drive over them, that I'd use them as speed bumps, etc., that, you know, they should be locked up or whatever. But in fact, somebody came in and made a fantastic comment in defense. And I would say, in terms of us all taking action, is if you aren't prepared to sit on a street or alternatively enter politics or take some of these more at the front actions, then you do need to try and support on social media, which can be pretty painful, but come in. But somebody came up with a lovely comment, and the person said, all these people making vitriolic comments, how are they going to look back on their comments in 40 years' time when we see what's happened to the planet? And in fact, Just Stop Oil were effectively the start of the suffragette movement, or whatever it would be. Do we look back now on the suffragettes and go and say how wrong they were, or do we look on them as being out there at the front, taking the heat for actually what we all now believe is the right thing? So I thought it was a very, very good comment and a very good way to put it. And then just one other on LBC, actually. I was commenting on LBC, but I was on a show where the start of it actually was not looking at the idea of taking action and whether Just Stop Oil is completely wrong. It was how we all react differently to the type of action taken. So some people see sitting on the road is the right thing to do, but not hanging yourself off a bridge or throwing paint over something and actual criminal damage. And we have a different view on these different types of action. So it's not always that, linear, in the sense that we just have a point where we all switch from one to the other. So Carter, I just want to come back as you brought the equality part into it and re-challenge you on it. So there's going to be no equality if we allow the world to go up to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. And in fact, again, on our population issue as well, and that's overlapping clearly with equality, population, and the fair start. There's going to be no fair starts for anybody, and particularly not for the vulnerable group, which could grow to vast percentages of the population if we allow the temperature to go up. Shouldn't we forget worrying about equality for the moment, get on solve the climate, and then solve our equality when we've got a planet that we know we're going to survive on in 20 years' time?
Yeah, I think you could easily start with something like a carbon tax, although I'd probably reframe it as an ecocide tax to try to limit the emissions as an emergency measure right now. And in fact, we talk about legislative processes to do this, but it's within the authority of things like the executive administration of the United States to do it as an emergency measure. The President Biden could declare a climate emergency that would override a lot of the slower processes. The question is how you're going to spend the money that you get with those taxes. And of course, a lot of businesses would like to spend it on green infrastructure that would allow them to continue profits. Another alternative that would address inequity is in California, now in the District of Columbia in DC, there is a baby bond process where every child born under a certain level of income, in California, it was babies that were born whose parents were killed in the pandemic, receive a $500 savings bond. It could be used for college when it matures. It could be used for healthcare, education. And the idea is, why do rich parents get to give their kids trust funds and poor kids don't get it? Well, you get these baby bonds. The idea is you could use that money from a carbon or ecocide tax to fund baby bonds. Those baby bonds could be progressively scaled as a way of giving back to future generations for the harm that will cause them. So I don't think you need to decouple an emergency measure like imposing a tax on the industries creating the crisis. I don't think you need to decouple that from inequity. And the last thing I'll say about the vitriolic commenters, it's pure proof that we have a family planning system that basically created people for shopping malls and not for town halls. because you have a few people who really care about the public interest. And then you've got all these other people that really just care about their own private interests. They were created that way. They were created that way by a system that wanted economic growth because they don't need to care about public interest. They just are there to be economic inputs. And that fact, when you see how many people don't care about the future, that should jar us to want to become different people. And I'm a little different than Steve in that I think the way we become different people, we can ourselves act differently, but we can also change the way we plan families to make ourselves better.
Yeah, and I think your comments to some extent reflects a few comments that have come in the chat. Is to some extent we have to do both. So but if we don't get that climate down, the rest will be more difficult, of course. Anyway, now we've had some comments now about carbon tax, carbon rationing come in, and I think I'm gonna. So let's deal with that. And honestly, I hope you guys are enjoying it as much as I am. So because we've sort of gone over our normal stop time of an hour and a half. I think we'll plow through for it if you're happy for another 10 or 15 minutes and maybe cut off just before the 2-hour mark. So let's look at actually what we might be able to do. So Naomi, so should we be, is the solution, and I like to focus on just the national one because it's too difficult, all the geopolitical politics internationally is very, very difficult to look at. But looking at the national one, and let's take UK, but if you have another example, that's fine. Should we be trying to bring in a tax, bring in a fee, at the point of extraction? And a comment that was coming, I think, from Robert is that wouldn't be enough, just a tax. But let's assume that was a tax that became quite punitive after a very short period of time. So you bring it in, then you ramp it up rapidly. Now, very, very difficult that as well to sell to the electorate. So on the basis you're going to be Prime Minister in the future, it'd be a difficult one to get elected on. But if you were going to get elected on it, if we then go to the Canadian, I think it is Swiss, possibly Swiss model of carbon tax at source dividend, and by dividend I mean that we pay out all the money to the electorate. Everybody gets the same amount of money. Is that the way we should be doing it?
It's a great question, Ed, and I think I'll refer to the Irish policy, which Ireland was one of the first to bring in a carbon tax in Europe, and it's been mixed in terms of its effectiveness. Of course, there was a huge amount of backlash because people didn't want carbon taxes at source. But ultimately, what the Irish government did, and this is what seems very fair approach in terms of thinking about equity, they took the dividend and they gave it back into a fuel allowance for the people who are most in poverty. So you're redistributing that wealth. And in that sense, I would see that as a really, really effective policy. The difficulty is it's not costing enough. It's not hurting the extractive process enough and those corporations. So it needs to be much, much higher. But I would add that, again, this can't be just one, carbon taxes alone are not going to solve this. We have to take an all-encompassing approach to radical transformation across the board.
Naomi, can we bring in a carbon tax and get it up to such a level that it stops extraction? Are we ever going to achieve that, or do we need, and I think it was Andy mentioning about that, but actually what we need to do is just ban extraction. Can carbon tax do it?
I think carbon tax can do it.
Okay. Right. Okay, great. Steve, coming over to you then, and just imagining this carbon tax coming in. So we've got a big carbon tax coming in on everything, and you've got 100 SMEs that you're going to go and be talking to about what they're going to be doing. And because we've got this big carbon tax, and if there even was a dividend, it's going either, as the Irish are doing it, to those most in poverty to pay their fuel bills, or it's going to be paid out to everybody across the board, which actually still means that those at the lower end in terms of financial vulnerability get more as a percentage. So that's what's happening. Nothing's going to the SMEs. Okay, so now we've got our SMEs talking to you about 17 SDGs. We put a carbon tax in on it. Their energy prices are going up. So many other things are going up that they're having to use. Would that work? Could it work? Would it destroy them?
I suspect a carbon tax is part of the solution, but I don't think it'll change enough behavior within enough people quickly enough. It is my sense. And as someone said in the comments, just look at energy prices have gone up way more than any kind of conceivable carbon tax that would have been mooted 2 years ago. And yet we are still consuming almost the same amount, a little bit less. It's marginal. I don't think it's So I've toyed with an idea, and this is not well formed, and it's possibly completely stupid. But my sense is, and the social media, you know, the one positive about all the stupid comments, all the ridiculous negativity on social media is that that's captured, and that can come back to haunt people, as social media posts often have in the past. Now, I would love to take that principle. I'd love there to be some way of capturing that, the essence of that, and wouldn't it be great if there was a register of where we stood on carbon, and where you could say whether you say what you're doing and what your beliefs are, and that comes back to haunt you if you're on one side of the spectrum. Because I think that at the moment there's just not enough accountability. There's not enough personal consequences to those people that refuse to do anything, or refuse to believe, or refuse to think that it's their job to take action, or hide behind it's all the Chinese, what difference will it make if we do something in this country? All of those excuses. There is no accountability around that. But if we went 20 years down the line and the grandchildren were, it's like that famous poster in the First World War, what did you do during the Great War, Granddad? And with the child sitting on the knee. There is accountability, and there is person, and if it was demonstrable that I did nothing because I was a denier, and I was absolutely quite the opposite, I was, arguing that those people shouldn't be trying, and that we shouldn't have carbon taxes, and so on and so forth, then there'll be a degree of accountability. And I wonder whether that would actually also contribute towards getting more people to recognize there are consequences, to think about the long-term implications. What would you do? What did you do during the war, Dad or Granddad or whatever? There is none of that at the moment, apart from the little traces that are left in social media. But I would love there to be some kind of register where those of us that were trying to do something could say so, and those that weren't trying to do anything, or at the other end of the spectrum, were either called out in some way. I know this is naming and shaming, but ultimately we've got to use all the levers we can to change behavior. Tax is one of them, but I don't think it's enough. And maybe there's something in that.
Great, thanks. And I see Phoebe commenting we need to use every tool in the toolbox. And I think we would all agree with that, even though we're trying to draw out what are the most important tools and that sort of thing on it. Graham, Malcolm and Will have come in talking about giving up stuff. Individuals should be I use that rather flippantly, but giving up stuff. So whether it's giving up flying, giving up meat, giving up dairy, all these other things that we should be doing. But let me bring it back to where we were on this carbon tax. I think we'll come to Victoria then first on this, is in order to people giving it up always sounds like we're not doing the right thing. And oddly enough, when I went door to door again talking to people, I heard people say, and I couldn't get it to begin with, I heard them say again and again, I would do more if my neighbor was. I'll do more if my neighbor does. And then I twigged it that it sort of comes out of COVID-19 and our experience of actually I'll put a mask on if my neighbor's putting a mask on. I'll only go out for 20 minutes a day exercising if everybody else does. And actually, in a funny sense, I feel part of the war effort in terms of doing it. That's what it sort of came down to. Now, why did we then do it together is because government imposed it. So let's come back to where we were just a couple of minutes ago, carbon tax. Let's put in a carbon tax that goes £10, £20, £30, just ramps up really, really, really rapidly. And then actually your beef from New Zealand will end up at 300 or 400 times the price it was, because it's got a tax on the methane, it's got a tax on it getting to us and a whole lot of other things. And apples from Kent will end up being about 1p, and we'll all suddenly start eating a whole lot of apples. But isn't that really the way to do it? Can we expect individuals to do it, even if they're going to encourage each other like we're getting in the chat? Or does it have to come from government? And if it comes from government, isn't the simplest one just to whack on that carbon tax, firstly on extraction and then on anybody who's polluting?
So starting with the carbon tax, yes, but we need to think about where we want to get to with the end game. So if we're putting a carbon tax on, we need to then think about the distribution of that wealth. We need to think about if it's in local communities, what does that do to the money multiplier? If we're putting a tax on businesses, what does that do to jobs? So that's quite a difficult, small microeconomic kind of problem within regions and within a small country like the UK. So in principle, yes, but I think it would have to have other mechanisms around it for it to be fair for businesses. And I also think you need to, when you have a tax, you also need an incentive. So to avoid that tax, it would be businesses rapidly moving from that very linear product structure to something that is completely and provable circular. So if you're manufacturing anything, the inputs that come in, they stay in and they stay in use for the longest possible time, because that's where we really want to get to, essentially. So we don't need any more resources coming in. We're continually renewing everything. And with your question going door to door and what do people say if they're going to do it, if their neighbour will do it, that really speaks to the kind of research that I'm doing in around values and behaviour. And when you really ask people what they value in life and what their values are, I've had nobody say I value SUVs or a new iPhone every day. Nobody said that. They all talk about health, time with family, happiness, well-being, access to nature, more leisure time. That's what's really important to people in this climate emergency. It isn't stuff, it isn't other things, and it's generally not wealth. It's well-being and happiness. So I think it's trying to connect people when we think about giving up stuff. All right, we might have to cut down, well, we should cut down or give up on meat and all those other things. But what do we gain when we get that? Do we gain what we really value? And I think in the grand scheme of things, we do. We just need to communicate that.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to come around to all of our four speakers again in a second for your sort of final comments, I think. And just to guide you, and then I'm going to talk just for another 30 seconds, give you time to think. It's always nice if you can come up with a silver bullet. So if you've got a silver bullet, or even if you happen to have 6 or 7 silver bullets and you can mention it to us. So what are our silver bullets that we could have to solve the climate crisis? And then let's also think of the SDGs. And we've had quite a lot of comments about the SDGs and that, but you're all aware of what they are. And if there was 1 or 2 or 3, so if you were going to prioritize your SDGs, tell us what they are in your final comments and why you prioritize them, even if you think they're not strong enough or need to be altered or updated. But if you can come to that. So just while you're thinking, and I'll start with Steve when I come, but I just wanted to add in a bit, adding to what Victoria was just saying. And Victoria may know the piece of research and correct me on the figures, but it is very interesting that that we see all of these negative commentators on TikTok and on Facebook and all these other, Twitter particularly, about Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. And a lot of people feel that they shouldn't be standing up for them and saying things. And I do agree, you might want to choose your words carefully when you do it, but I would call everybody to action, to stand up. And the reason you need to stand up is just like XR sitting down themselves. It's just like us forming a political party so we can all stand up and talk about it. It's just like the climate strikers or anybody else doing something, is you create a wedge for others to start doing it. And you'd be surprised if you make a comment that other people will come in behind you. And often actually the positive comments, when these trolls are at it, get hundreds and hundreds of likes, whereas the trolls only go a dozen or 2. So although they're commenting, actually the likes are coming behind the 1 or 2 brave people that make that comment. Now there was, what is interesting is there was the study in America, this is what I'm saying, Victoria, you may be able to correct me if I get it all wrong, where they asked people in America, are they worried about the climate crisis and do they want more action? And roughly speaking, it was 80% of people who said, yes, I'm worried. Yes, I'd like to see more action. And then they asked the same people, and do you think other people think like you? And only half of those people thought that everyone else thought like them. So bizarrely, I actually think that I want to take more action on the climate crisis, but I'm scared to talk about it. I'm scared to make my comments because I actually think the majority of other people don't agree with me, but actually they do because they all want to take action, but they're not talking to everybody. Anyway, I just throw that in as a sort of point of discussion. And then maybe now we can come up with our summaries for about probably 1.5 minutes, including a silver bullet and or your top SDGs.
Did you say you wanted me to talk first?
Yes, Steve. You don't mind going first. So
yeah, for me, it's all about leading by example. It's by being the change we want to see. It's by driving action or building habitual action into all aspects, all corners of our lives, our businesses, our families, and recognizing that when we do that, others will. We moved into this house we downscaled to a smaller house. We've got heat pumps about to go in soon when that won't be very visible. But the solar panels which we had put on were visible, and already one other house in the street. There were no solar panels in this street whatsoever prior to July when we had ours put in, and now there's two sets, ours and someone else's. So I'm not saying that we necessarily inspire that, but you kind of give permission. People see other people's behavior and they, oh yeah, I could do that, or they look into it and they find. So let's be let's be the change we want to see. It's not someone else's problem to solve. It's our problem, each and every single one of us, to contribute where we can, where we get most excited, most enthused. That will be different for each of us, but our contributions will add up. There is no room for complacency, but also there's no need for fatalism either. You know, things are changing, and we, starting today with the 40 of us on this, can do more and more and more, can and should. And I've got a little grandson now. I want to make sure that we do, because, you know, their legacy is what we create, and it's our responsibility to make sure we create something wonderful and don't mess it up. Statement of the obvious, but for me, it's all about our individual action and our individual accountability.
So inspiring and positive, Steve. I'll let you go on. Now, for everybody else, it's about 45 seconds. So if you can really cut yourselves down and do it. But that's great. No, well done, Steve. It was great to hear it. So let's go to Carter then, please. Carter next. We'll come back to Naomi, and then Victoria, you can close.
Yeah, I'd choose inequality. I would convince people that their children have a right to a fair start in life, which means redistribution of wealth. And I would target a handful of high-profile individuals to support a carbon tax as a way to help pay for those bonds. And you know, if that means taking it to the street before Congress acts, I'd support that fully.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carter. Naomi?
I would choose number 16, justice. And I particularly think of justice for our young people. And I'll finish with a quote from my godchild when she witnessed a climate collapse event with me last year. Our town got cut off by a landslide in Switzerland where we were living. And she turned around to me and she said, did all of the adults know that our world was ending? And I had to say yes. So it's not in 10 years' time, Ed. It's now. And when she asked me, and what have they been doing? And I said, they've been writing white papers and trying to tell politicians, and they've been doing things like cycling and recycling. She cut me off and she shouted at me, cycling and recycling. That's all you could think of. You're supposed to be the adults. You're supposed to protect us. We're not doing our jobs, folks. We need to be doing our jobs.
Absolutely. Thank you. Victoria.
So my takeaway would be, think about all of your actions. Actually, each individual and each and every one of us are really powerful. We have a voice. We have the ability to affect change within our friends and family, our community, and within our business sphere, whatever that is. So every single thing that you do can make a huge difference. And try and pinpoint the things that will make the most difference, and be really vocal about that. And do everything that you can. If you're not into going out and getting arrested, then you can donate to Just Stop Oil. You can have a huge amount of influence in every single area of your life. And I would support Goal 8, but I would say, really think about what sustainable development means for you in every part of your life. And why don't you rewrite the script instead of waiting for other people to do it?
Well, it's a pretty inspiring end, guys, actually. I don't think you could have done better as a group with all of that. And a very powerful share there, Naomi. Thanks very much for that. I have a much less powerful thing, but just something that I think fits a little bit with the fairness and equity. I have never understood why we got obsessed with these R's. Reduce, reuse, recycle, and all that sort of thing. I've never been able to understand why we don't stick an S in, which is share. Because if we just shared, actually so many of the other ones, we wouldn't need to do them, or would need to do them as much. And that comes in every sense then with what you've all been saying in terms of fairness and equity and everything else. And then I would just then say that with all these sort of powerful endings from people, the number one thing everyone has to do is come to action. Now, I know, and I think we all do, that we're in an echo chamber, and having seen all of the comments coming in, it's like we all agree with each other. We may not agree on the details or the absolute focus, but we're in an echo chamber. So next time Scientist Warning has one of these, and we'll hope to make it just as provocative and just as informative as this, I challenge all those people who are here to take action and bring somebody else with you who isn't from the echo chamber. So go out and find somebody not from the echo chamber and bring them here with us, and let them hear all this stuff that we're saying, and let's hear their comments, and let's actually want to hear their comments so that we can deal with it and everything else. So let's try and do that and bring them in. And the other part of taking action, I think we've heard it from probably 2 or 3 of the speakers, plus from 3 or 4 people in the chat, is let's come to action politically. And that means putting pressure on, because you're on the streets taking action. The other stuff of writing to your MPs and your councillors, do it. It isn't useless, do it. And it does help and it does inspire action, but get involved in the process yourself. Go and join that parish council, vote for Naomi for Prime Minister, I certainly will be, and let's get some of the right people in, but go and join the process yourself. Literally there's 3,000, and that's, I don't know the figures in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Ireland and other countries. Look, there could be enormous numbers of opportunities that we can all get involved in. Let's go and take the action now, because there isn't any time. And when we talk, even the 6.5 years to get to the certain targets, we're only going to get there if we start taking deep dive action now. Not this sort of curve of coming down towards the net zero, but the deep dive action now. And that's today to get us action to have any chance of getting there by 6.5 years from now. Anyway, fantastic panel. I loved it. I could go on forever. And I suspect if we were sitting around in a room with a coffee, we would be going on forever. So thank you so much for this. Now, if everybody could keep up with Scientist Warning website, make sure you're following us on Eventbrite for the next one of these. And please come to action just so that you're inspired by these speakers. Think of the amazing stuff they've said. I mean, really extraordinary, guys. Really, really, really brilliant. Thank you very much. And I hate to sort of be smiling at the end of something where we talk about something so dire, but it's been a great event and very inspiring. So a big smile to say thank you for your participation and thank you for everybody for coming. All the best, everybody. Bye-bye.